From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lines, I'm Joe Matthew.
A new round of polling finds good news for Donald Trump in the Sun Belt states, leading Kamala Harris in both Arizona and Georgia. Both candidates set to deliver economic policy speeches this week as Trump says no to another debate in late October.
We'll follow the polling and the money with political scientist Samara Klar from the University of Arizona as lawmakers return to Washington this week with just 1 week to a possible government shutdown.
And with the United Nations General Assembly set to begin this week amid escalating conflict between Israel and Hezbollah, we're joined by Douglas Rediker from the International Capital Strategies on the rising level of risk to the economy and to markets. So we kick off a week here in Washington, Joe, where we will be simultaneously focused on both domestic politics, including the freshest polling in the presidential race, but geopolitics as well as world leaders gather in New York. Yeah, it's a dangerous moment here in the Middle East. Things did not ratchet down over the weekend, quite the opposite. And we saw strikes today by Israel against Lebanon that claimed some 300 lives and injured about 1,000 more. Kaylee, there are big questions about our policy in Israel and whether a ceasefire deal is now dead. Well, of course, that's something the administration is still pushing for, but you're exactly right. And of course, it doesn't end there in terms of the geopolitical allies and adversaries that will be under consideration this week, including China. And this is actually something that Donald Trump was speaking about this afternoon in Pennsylvania.
The first thing I'd do is my first call, I'm going to call up President Xi. I'm going to say, you have to honor the deal you made. We made a deal. You'd buy $50 billion worth of American farm product, and I guarantee you he will buy it, 100%. He will buy it. Second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say, you have to give the death penalty to your fentanyl dealers.
Joining us now, Bloomberg's Stephanie Lai, who covers the Trump campaign, in fact, just returned from his rally in North Carolina. And I know you're on your way to Georgia next, so thanks for spending some time with us in a very busy time. This is the final sprint, and I guess it shouldn't be lost on us that while we're talking about geopolitics here at the beginning of UNGA week, we're talking about the economy still as well, with new polling showing Donald Trump holding a lead still on the issue of who you trust to handle the economy. And both candidates this week speaking to that issue on the campaign trail on back-to-back days, rounding out their economic policy proposals. I guess it's no mystery why.
Certainly. And so tomorrow at his rally in Savannah, Georgia, he's expected to talk about his tax code policies and U.S. manufacturing. So that's something that we've been tracking very closely here at Bloomberg. And in the last couple of weeks, we've seen him sort of promote a variety of interesting ideas. You know, no tax on overtime wages, no tax on tips, no tax on Social Security benefits, all of these things that, you know, might have confounded a voter thinking about what Donald Trump's tax policy would have been just a couple of months ago. But overall, the message that he's sending is that he's trying to lower the cost of living for everyday Americans.
Well, and of course, in some ways, his tax policy is also tied to manufacturing policies. He's floating a lower corporate tax rate specifically for companies that make their goods in the U.S. Would be looking at a tax rate of 15%. Of course, as he's making these pitches specifically in swing states, it is worth noting he was in Pennsylvania today. Georgia will be tomorrow. According to the latest New York Times Siena poll, he is up by 4 points. That is within the margin of error. Trump 49, Harris 45. In the Sun Belt, perhaps these are encouraging figures for the Trump campaign?
Possibly, but one thing that I would caution is that it seems like these numbers have been going back and forth quite a bit, almost ping-ponging between the two candidates, one up one day, one up the next day. And of course, you know, there's still so much time between now and November 5th. So what we see right now might not necessarily apply to next week.
Well, and in 1 week, a week from tomorrow, we'll be looking at the next debate. Vice presidential candidates both are preparing now. We understand Tom Emmer is acting in this case as Tim Walz when J.D. Vance is sparring. Tim Walz reportedly using Pete Buttigieg in place of J.D. Vance. How important is this? We've been debating whether there'll be a second presidential debate. Do people care about the running mates in this campaign?
I do think that in a sense it is important because a lot of Americans don't actually know who Senator J.D. Vance is or Governor Walz is. So this is really their chance to introduce themselves to the national stage. And the fact that we might not have another presidential debate, it's really their message is the final thing that we'll hear from these campaigns. And to go to your earlier point about Vance's debate prep, sources have been telling me that he really ratcheted it up in the last week. You know, of course, he isn't taking it too seriously, but he does still care about it and is putting more effort into it than he would a normal public appearance.
Sure.
All right, Bloomberg's Stephanie Lai with a brief rest period in Washington before she heads back out onto the trail. Thank you so much. Now in the Middle East, Israel said a campaign of airstrikes today hit 1,300 Hezbollah targets in Lebanon, where health officials said 356 people were killed. John Kirby, White House National Security Communications Advisor, had this to say about the escalating tensions on Fox yesterday.
We don't believe that escalating this conflict militarily is the best way to get those families back to their kibbutzes, back to their homes and to their lives. We still believe that there is time and space for diplomacy to work here. Now, again, we're not Pollyannish. We're watching the tensions escalate here over the last few days.
The Pentagon now says the U.S. is sending a, quote, small number of additional military personnel to the region. Joining us now for more is Bloomberg's Dan Flatley, who covers national security for us from here in Washington. So obviously we are still seeing, frankly, the trading, the exchanging of fire between Israel and Hezbollah with no sign that it's going to let up anytime soon as the UN General Assembly gets underway. How concerning a moment is this for the U.S. administration and for the others that will be gathered in New York?
Well, I think it's certainly going to be top of mind. I mean, last year, really the focus was on President Zelensky and Ukraine and what's going on there with regard to the Russian invasion. This year, it's hard to ignore what's happening in the Middle East, obviously, because we see these images in real time. And so I think that will be top of mind, certainly for the diplomats who are in New York for the UN General Assembly, but also for folks here in the Biden administration in Washington. As you heard Admiral Kirby there talking about not wanting to see escalation. You know, Israel is a very close ally of the United States, and the United States provides Israel with a lot of munitions and other support. But, you know, there's only so much influence that the U.S. can exert if Israel feels like, you know, they need to take these steps in order to secure that northern part of their country and attack southern Lebanon. So it's going to be very interesting to see how all that plays out. I think that if Prime Minister Netanyahu makes it to New York this week, to hear what he has to say about this entire operation will be very interesting, and to see how the administration reacts.
We keep hearing concerns about a war between Israel and Hezbollah. But as you reminded us earlier, it was a week ago today, pagers were blowing up in Lebanon. The day after, walkie-talkies, solar installations, then crossfire for days across the border between the two. What would we call this? And should we start thinking about this as the beginning of a new war?
Well, it's hard to say exactly when a conflict turns into a war. I mean, typically there's no, line of embarkation where it automatically happens. These things tend to boil until they boil over. I think that what we're seeing here, certainly from the Israeli perspective, they have not talked about boots on the ground. So they are not considering this a war. They're considering this a quote-unquote air campaign. That doesn't really matter if you're on the receiving end of a bomb.
Fair enough.
But at the same time, I think the intent is to limit it to an operation that is going to basically push Hezbollah back north enough in Lebanon for Israeli citizens to sort of start moving back into that northern part of their country. Whether that's successful or not at the end of the day, or if it leads to additional escalation, in part depends, I think, a little bit on what some of the diplomats are able to work out on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly this week in New York.
Well, and of course, the other thing diplomats will likely be pushing for is a ceasefire with Hamas as they keep one eye on the conflict with Hezbollah. Is there a feeling, though, that is just getting farther and farther from being realized?
I think definitely it's getting farther and farther away. It's sort of receding into the background. Whether President Biden can get that done by the end of his administration is an open question. I certainly think that that is the intent of the administration, to keep pushing on that. But as we see from Israel's perspective, they feel that they have a war or a conflict or whatever you want to call it on two fronts, and they are now shifting their focus to the north. What the ultimate strategic goal with all of that is sort of remains to be seen, but it certainly doesn't help a ceasefire.
Well, it's good to have you back here at the table at an important moment. Dan Flatley on Bloomberg's national security team, thank you. Coming up, a look at the recent poll numbers for Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, specifically in Arizona, what that may mean down ballot this November. Samara Klar, political science professor at the University of Arizona, joins us next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Abortion continues to be an important winning issue. Certainly the Harris camp is hopeful that that ballot initiative will bring out voters who might not otherwise vote, younger voters, young women, and that those voters could narrow this current 5-point gap that Harris suffers from there in Arizona.
That's Don Levy, director of the Siena College Research Institute, on the early edition of Balance of Power today with new data on several swing states, including Arizona, that we want to talk about with Samara Klar, political science professor at the University of Arizona, co-author of the new book, Partisan Hostility and American Democracy, explaining political divisions and when they matter. We have some divisions to talk about, Professor. It's great to have you back. I'd like to start broadly with you here on this Siena poll. Got a lot of attention over the last 24 hours with Donald Trump breaking out in a 5-point lead over Kamala Harris in Arizona. But it argues with a couple of factors, including the referendum that we just talked about. This, of course, also on the ballot, as well as numbers showing the Democrat leading in the Senate race in Arizona. How do you rationalize all of these numbers hitting at once?
Sure. So the first thing I'd say is, this poll that you cite from Siena, it has Trump ahead, not outside the margin of error, just like the previous poll they did had Harris ahead, also not outside the margin of error. So we are seeing a little bit of back and forth here between the two candidates, but neither candidate has yet to really break outside of that window where we would consider them to be really statistically significantly ahead. That's what I've been finding too. I did a poll of 1,000 registered voters with TrueDot a couple weeks ago, and what we found in Arizona is similar. It's so close. Mm-hmm. It's really hard to see either candidate ahead out of that margin of error right now.
Well, and especially as we consider that margin of error, it's also worth considering the margin of undecideds, because in this polling across these three swing states, so including Arizona, Georgia, and North Carolina, according to the Times Siena polling, 15% of the electorate describe themselves as undecided or not definitely decided. What will sway those undecided voters in Arizona between now and Election Day?
That's a great question. I think either campaign would pay you probably $1 million if you could answer that question for them. What we have is a larger percentage who say they're undecided than the difference between the two candidates. So this really is, although it's a small percentage, it's enough to make a difference. And I would assume as the election nears, that undecided group should shrink, but we're getting close. Early voting in Arizona starts in October. We're not far away here. And, up to 90% of Arizona voters do vote by mail. So I would expect to see that gap get smaller, but it's persisted, and it is a substantial percentage of the electorate, given how close this race is.
Makes me want to ask you how many days we're going to have to wait for the race in Arizona to be called, Professor. But I want to get back to what Don Levy was saying, and that's this ballot measure that would codify what they call the fundamental right to an abortion. It's supported by 58% of likely voters in this poll. How could Donald Trump win Arizona while that still exists?
We have a really interesting mix of races here in Arizona. We have Trump ahead a little. We have Gallego, the Democratic Senate candidate, ahead by quite a lot. Looks like abortion should pass. The same number that you cite, 58%. That's about what I've been seeing in my polls, too, right about 58%. I'd be very surprised to see that ballot measure fail. Now, we also have this immigration ballot measure, which is more of a conservative-leaning measure, and that could pass as well. So we could end up with Trump winning, Gallego winning, abortion passing, and this immigration measure passing, which is like a real potpourri of liberal and conservative wins and losses across the ballot. But you know what? Arizona's like that. We've got a very close electorate. If you look at the voters in Arizona, they're divided very, very evenly, especially with those independents. You know, we've got about 36% of voters who are registered as Republicans, about 30% Democrats, about 35% who register as independents. And they seem to be moving these races in kind of unpredictable ways.
Yeah, it's like a really complicated parlay bet almost, that all of these variables that you'd think wouldn't be happening simultaneously very realistically could. And to your point about the nature of the independent Arizona voter, this is something we've discussed with you before, the idea that it's actually going to be about driving those people potentially to turn out. Door knocking is important. We've had reporting on a difficulty in the kind of ground game, the door knocking operations of the Trump campaign specifically in a number of battleground states. Are you seeing evidence of potential weakness there in Arizona?
Well, you know, Arizona is such a swing state right now that there's a big presence from both campaigns. I mean, I was, bike 3 miles home from campus today, and I'm seeing Trump signs and Harris signs all over the place. So there's a lot of engagement here, but it's such a tight race. So, it's hard to know how this is going to go. Arizona has more Republicans than Democrats, so that's helpful to the Trump campaign. But there's a lot of enthusiasm for Harris, especially since she entered the race a little bit, a little late in the game. The Harris campaign is targeting the college campuses. The Harris campaign is targeting smaller towns that Democrats haven't typically tried to mobilize before. We saw Tim and Glenn Walz out in Arizona talking to sort of smaller communities, Mormon communities where Democrats haven't typically spent a lot of their efforts. So we are seeing the Democrats making a really, really big play for Arizona, trying to get more votes out than Biden did. Biden won here by 0.36 percentage points. So they're trying to build on that.
Professor, I want to go back to North Carolina Saturday and Donald Trump, in which he was talking about a range of issues, as always, in what was a pretty lengthy rally, but tried to send a message directly to women. And it was word for word what he had posted on Truth Social, in which he said, "I will protect women at a level never seen before. They will finally be healthy, hopeful, safe, and secure. Their lives will be happy, beautiful, and great again." He went on to project his impression of what it's like to be a woman in the United States right now. Listen to what he said.
So let's talk about our great women. Women have gone through a lot. They've gone through a lot. Women are poorer than they were 4 years ago, are less healthy than they were 4 years ago, are less safe on the streets than they were 4 years ago. I will fix all of that, women. I will fix all of that, and I will fix it fast. And at long last, this national nightmare that we're going through will be over. Women will be happy, healthy, confident, and free. You will no longer be thinking about abortion, because it is now where it always had to be, with the states and with the vote of the people.
So, Professor, keeping in mind that he's running against a woman, to what extent does it help Donald Trump tell women how they feel about their health, how they feel about their reproductive rights?
Well, what I think he's speaking to is honestly the issue he has with abortion. I mean, the Republican Party has aligned themselves with a pro-life position for years, and they're now trying to extricate themselves from that position because the American public is not supportive of a ban. There is broad support for reproductive rights, granted at different points in a pregnancy. Not everybody agrees on when that would be. And now Donald Trump and Arizona Republicans like Carrie Lake and Juan Ciscomani have to figure out a way to win back this core group of voters who care a lot about reproductive rights and say that they'll be voting on that issue. So, we've seen Trump pivot a little bit on abortion. He no longer will describe himself as pro-life. He now says it's the kind of issue that needs to be in the hands of the voters, which is what we just heard him say. That seems to be how most Republicans are taking this issue. But abortion is a really tough issue for Republicans running right now because they've had to make a really big switch given the polling data. Again, the polling data that I've been doing here in Arizona shows very broad support for that abortion measure, even with Donald Trump leading among voters.
All right, Samara Klar, always great to have you here on Balance of Power, political science professor at the University of Arizona. We appreciate your time. Now coming up, Fed officials signal more rate cuts are coming after last week's 50 basis point reduction. We'll have the latest next on Bloomberg TV and radio.
if conditions continue like this, there are a lot of cuts to come over the next 12 months. There's virtual unanimity about that.
That was Austin Goolsbee, Chicago Fed president, on the possibility of more rate cuts in the upcoming year after they slashed rates by 50 basis points last week. Joining us now for more is Bloomberg's Amara Omeokwe, who is here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio on Bloomberg TV and radio. So we heard from Chairman Powell last week, don't expect this to be the new pace. And yet it does suggest that some of these Fed speakers in the aftermath are saying, well, it could be the new pace.
Well, yeah, and Goolsbee has been one of the Fed officials who has really been sounding the alarm on the labor market. He has made the point time and time again that you don't want to be acting too late, because once the labor market starts to weaken significantly, it can be kind of hard to rein it back in. So I think his comments today saying, you know, we're going to see a lot more rate cuts is basically reflective of his position, which is that the Fed should really be trying to shore up the labor market here and protect it from further weakening.
Well, we're stepping through a bunch of Fed speak today, so we're giving you the impossible job of helping to interpret with all this is. Mr. Goolsbee, what I've seen in the last 2 years is inflation has come way down without there being a recession. That sounds to me, as he says, that's never happened before in the U.S. or virtually anywhere in the world. That sounds to me like we believe in the soft landing, that we've made it. Raphael Bostic says separately, progress on inflation and the cooling in the labor market have emerged much more quickly than I imagined at the beginning of the summer. That sounds to me like we might be a little more worried about the R word. How do you rationalize those two statements?
Well, I think what you hear Fed officials saying is, like, we want to protect the labor market, but inflation is not yet down to our 2% target.
Right.
And so they're trying to calibrate carefully here, right? If they go too fast, right, that risks not really getting inflation down to where they want it to be.
They're spooked about this job market, though, aren't they?
They are spooked about the job market, but they have two responsibilities,
sure,
and they can't take their eye off either one. And so I think that's what you're hearing here. How fast do we go to keep both of our goals in mind and not compromise either?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, haunted by the ghosts perhaps of 40, 50 years ago when they made a mistake in easing too early. So I guess it raises the question, as we're going to view data upcoming over the course of the next several weeks, what we expect they would be most reactive to and the market will be most reactive to. I'm assuming it is still the employment data unless inflation really surprises to the upside.
I think that's right. I think from how you hear Fed officials talking, the focus is more on the labor market now, because for the last 2 years it was inflation because that was what was farther away from their target. Now they're looking at the labor market weakening and they're like, ooh, we don't want this to get too far away from our target of maximum employment. And so I think the burden of proof is on the labor market for sure.
Austin Goolsbee saying if you could just freeze it in place right now, exactly where it is,
perfect, yeah,
you'd be set, right? That means get to neutral as fast as possible?
I think it depends on who you ask,
you can
right?
slow me down on that.
There are questions about where neutral is even in this post-pandemic world that we're living in. Some people think it's higher. So.
What is our star?
What is our star?
We're going to do the rest of the hour now with Amara. Many thanks, Samara Omeokwe. Thank you so much here on Balance of Power. We'll have a lot more ahead as we get the UN General Assembly underway next on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Following indications that Hezbollah was preparing to fire towards Israeli territory, we began striking terrorist targets throughout Lebanon. The Hezbollah terrorist organization has been continuously launching attacks on Israeli civilians and has no plans to stop.
Tensions escalating between Israel and Hezbollah as the United Nations General Assembly is set to begin in New York City this week. So joining us now for more is Douglas Rediker. He is managing partner of International Capital Strategies, live with us in our Washington, D.C. studio here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Douglas, great to see you. Obviously, we come into this UNGA week with multiple conflicts throughout the world. This one, perhaps, though, is burning the hottest, if you will, or at least we're seeing more development each and every day, it seems. Is this going to be what dominates conversation?
Well, in many ways it should be, because it is loss of life and a huge potential risk of blowing into a major war or even a regional war. But no, I don't think this is going to be the dominant theme at UNGA this week. I think the U.S. presidential election is still the elephant in every single room. And that's because the difference between a Harris administration or a Trump administration is not only important on tax rates and tariff policy, but on almost everything else. So it's alliances, it's geostrategic issues, it's the war in Ukraine, it's everything. So that's not to say that Israel-Lebanon's not going to be a topic, but I don't think there's going to be anything that comes close to the U.S. election.
Well, out of all of those you mentioned, is tariff the scariest word in New York this week?
It's pretty damn close.
Yeah.
I think there is a major risk that some governments are starting to cotton on to, that if Trump were to do even some of what he has said he will do, whether it is the 20% across-the-board tariff or the tariffs on China or any subset thereof, that this has the risk of spiraling into a global trade war because you've got tit for tat for tit for tat. And that actually poses, and I'm not predicting this, but it's a risk of really serious downside global recession-style risks. And you've got to take that pretty seriously.
Well, he's talking about fresh tariffs today. He is suggesting now John Deere, if they move production to Mexico, will face a 200% tariff on everything they want to sell in the United States. He's floated 200% tariffs on, as well on EVs coming into the country. It does seem like the numbers might be getting higher and higher.
Yep.
And so we consider, especially when it comes to tariffs on China, if that would mean an actual complete decoupling of these economies, knowing the current administration has been very careful not even really to say decouple at all, but diversify, et cetera. But is that the moment we would be brought to if the kind of figures he's talking about become reality?
Well, look, if Trump were to go down the route of 60% tariffs, I'm using 60% because that's the figure that he apparently has used. I don't think that that just suddenly means, okay, everything's more expensive, so let's find another way to produce it somewhere else so you have that decoupling. I think that creates the dynamic I described before, which is you really get into a geopolitical, geoeconomic downward cycle in which the consequences could be fairly sudden and fairly dramatic. I don't think that that would stay put. So I don't think you're going to see Donald Trump, who has decided in his belief of how tariffs work, that they are costless. So therefore, I hadn't heard the 200%, but sure, why not 300%? Why not 400%? In other words, if he's going down the route in which tariffs are the silver bullet to everything that ails us, then escalating them for 10% to 20%, 100% to 200% becomes this.
He also says the revenue they create will offset all of the taxes.
But that's what I mean. So if that becomes the go-to, then I don't think you get to the point where you have this decoupled world. I think you have a potential for a bigger global crisis that happens before you get there. And then what happens on the back of that, sort of determines where you go from there.
The market seems to think there's something elusive about Kamala Harris, that there are uncertainties that they want to hear more about, that she's less of a sure thing than Donald Trump. Well, we talk about Trump's uncertainties at UNGA. What's the world community concerned about when it comes to Kamala Harris? What do they want to know?
I'm going to push back on that. I don't think the UNGA universe cares as much about specific policies as they do predictability and stability and continuity.
Does her affiliation with this administration and the role she plays as vice president help
Absolutely.
on that front?
So the expectation is that alliances remain predictable, that the multilateral system, for what it's worth, remains in place, that NATO remains something the U.S. stands behind. Go down the list. They are perfectly happy to say, we'll hear about policies later, as long as the basic fundamentals of the world order are something that is predictable. Now, there are some that don't like the current world order, so they would rather see a Trump win rather than a Harris one. Okay. But certainly the alliances and the institutions that we've all grown up expecting to be in place would most likely stay in place, and that's probably a good thing for stability going into and coming out of UNGA.
Do bodies like the United Nations still hold up that world order? Are they still effective in doing so?
With diminishing effectiveness. I think over time you've seen the multilateral world, which used to be manifest by the UN at the top, has devolved into the G20. And then the G20 has become much less effective and has sort of broken down into the G7 and the BRICS, and then a bunch of other what I call mini-laterals, so the Quad and others, where these alliances are shifting, and you have people or countries that are in multiple groups. Some of them are competing, but the rising above it all at the top, the UN that I grew up with, whether it was effective or not, we can make questions, but at least it was there as the pinnacle of that global system. I think is probably no longer the case. I think UNGA, and I hate to say this, is more effective for its sideline meetings than it is for the actual official meetings themselves.
Makes a lot of sense. Remember when Donald Trump was laughed at in front of the General Assembly in 2018? Would that happen again if he spoke now? Does that inform the way the UN looks at him now?
Well, he wouldn't speak now as a non-sitting
no, of course. But if that were to happen again, if he were reelected
next year, I don't think he would be laughed at because I think there's a greater sense of the authority of the President of the United States to do some unilateral things that affect countries and the world order. So I don't think it's a laughing matter. I think it's much more of a where do we go from here?
Fascinating. Thank you for joining us here at the table. Good luck on your journey to New York as you get involved in all of this. That's Douglas Rediker, of course, managing partner of International Capital Strategies. Douglas, thanks for coming back to see us on Bloomberg. Coming up, the takeaways from the Sun Belt polls from the New York Times, specifically Arizona. Our signature panel weighs in. Coming up next, Rick and Jeannie ahead on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
There's a lot of support for our message and what we need to do in terms of moving forward and charting a new way forward and dispensing with all of the attempts to divide our country and to just really the problem I think on the other side is that there is a devaluation of who the American people are.
That was Kamala Harris reacting yesterday to a question about her high fundraising numbers. With us now, our signature panel, Rick Davis, Stone Court Capital partner, and Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University and senior democracy fellow for the Center of the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Great to have you both here. Rick and Jeannie, welcome back. On the Monday edition of Balance of Power, we're looking at some pretty remarkable fundraising numbers here, Rick. Kamala Harris is outspending Donald Trump by about $5 million a day here. And I wonder the extent to which that makes a dent when you're running against the king of earned media.
Yeah, first of all, you'd always want to have the power of being able to broadcast your message the way you want to through the fog of the media bubble that's covering you. Donald Trump, yes, he's very good at doing the earned media, but he has to get through that bubble. So what does he do? He does a lot of his earned media through friendly outlets, which means he's only talking to a certain group of people. So there are downsides to being the king of free media. But when you own it and you can buy it yourself, you're talking directly to the voters with exactly the message that tests well.
Well, and Kamala Harris certainly is doing a lot of buying. We obviously have already seen that. Her figures for the month of September inclusive of planned spending, are about $152 million on advertising alone. But my question, Jeannie, does that kind of money typically buy you a bigger bump in the polls? Because we haven't necessarily seen that come to fruition. Sure, she's doing better than Joe Biden was, but she hasn't been drastically improving on that initial change.
Yeah, I mean, the money is going to help her. In a race this tight, it allows her, she's doing a lot of digital ad spending. That's allowing her to micro-target constituencies that she wants to attract. I know people who watched football yesterday, they were inundated with Kamala Harris ads, depending on where you were watching. I was not among them, not a big football person, but they were out there. The other thing in a race this tight, the money is very helpful for organizing on the ground. And we have seen the Harris campaign be able to do this very, very well in a way the Trump campaign simply cannot, given where they are financially. The Democrats have been very well organized, and that get out the vote is going to be critical because, to your point, Kayleigh, the polls are so tight at this point. You need every vote you can get in these swing states.
Much said already about the Siena College poll with the New York Times that came out over the weekend, showing Donald Trump, as we discussed a little bit earlier with Samara Klar, very competitive. In fact, 5 points ahead of Kamala Harris in Arizona, leading by 4 in Georgia, but neck and neck, just a 2-point within the margin lead in North Carolina. We all know about what's going on in North Carolina involving the Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson. and his experience with a porn site that came to light in a CNN story. I asked Don Levy about this at Siena College. He ran the numbers on North Carolina, and he had this to say on the early edition of Balance of Power about the contest in that state.
We're looking at a situation in North Carolina where I think the Republicans are going to remain worried about a reverse coattails that maybe could narrow that gap that we see right now between Trump up by 2 over Harris there in the Tar Heel state.
This poll ended, Rick, right before that story broke last week about Mark Robinson. Did the lieutenant governor just lose North Carolina for Donald Trump?
You know, he could have. I mean, my point of view is I think most of these states are going to reflect the national vote, right? So if Donald Trump is doing well in the state, it's more likely to inure to the benefit of the gubernatorial candidate, even though he's crippled his own campaign. So I don't think there'll be a reverse coattail. But that being said, I think what is shown is Kamala Harris has found a way to be very competitive in North Carolina like no Democrat has done in a long time. So I think that will bring this down to the wire in North Carolina. And remember, they're voting now in large numbers in North Carolina. So we're going to find out long before the election just how competitive this is.
Well, as we consider, Rick, the prospect that voting is underway in some states, Donald Trump is using that as an argument against doing another debate against Kamala Harris. He says it's too late on the proposed date of October 23rd. But this is what Kamala Harris had to say about it.
Join me on the debate stage. Let's have another debate. There's more to talk about, and the voters of America deserve to hear the conversations that I think we should be having on substance, on issues, on policies. What's your plan? What's my plan? And we should have another one before Election Day.
We'd like to get both of your thoughts on this, but Rick, just to begin with you, as someone who's run presidential campaigns in the past, given the performance we saw in the first debate between these two, would you be encouraging Donald Trump to try again?
Yeah, I think that it's a close election, and I think he wants to make up for the job that he did in the last debate. I mean, it was pretty clear that Kamala Harris took him to lunch and left him without a bag to eat. So the reality is, I think he's going to need that push. She's got momentum today. That's a dangerous thing. And if she continues that on, through the month of September into October, he's going to need a game changer. And the best game changer in American politics in the fall is a debate. And I think that he shouldn't be afraid of that. And he'd be crazy not to take her on if he feels like he's not going to win. And even if it's close, he's got to have another shot at the apple on this. So I think you might see a change of heart in a couple of weeks with Donald Trump.
All right, Jeannie, what's your thought? Who's eating whose lunch on a second debate?
I think Donald Trump, you look at the size of that audience for that first debate, and if he continues to be neck and neck with her, he's going to figure out a way to debate, although his team clearly does not want him to, because at the last debate, he was talking about people eating their pets. And the problem for Donald Trump is that he simply cannot stay on message. You look at these polls, if he talked about the economy, inflation, and immigration, and just that, he has a very good shot of beating Kamala Harris, but he simply has not been able to stay on message. So I hope he does it. I think if the polls stay this way, he'll reconsider, but I don't think he's going to want to do it on CNN. So maybe he'll come see you guys and do it here.
I guess we're all holding out hope for that, Jeannie. The invitation certainly is open. To your point, though, about staying on message on the issues like the economy, is that actually perhaps the best conduit or the best lane for Senator J.D. Vance as he gets set to debate Tim Walz next Tuesday in New York? He's a member of the Senate Banking Committee and former venture capitalist. Is that the best messenger for the Trump campaign?
You know, it's the messenger they have. Looking at his favorables in this latest New York Times poll, they are the worst amongst the entire lot. So J.D. Vance has some work to do. But, to your point, he is a very smart guy. He is a good debater. He's a good talker. He's been out doing a lot of interviews, more than Walz and Harris. So I think it's going to be a formidable debate. And I think if he can stick to message and not look, a little bit weird, a little bit crazy, and keep sort of in the middle of the road, I think he could have a very good debate against Tim Walz.
So that's the mission for everyone, is to not be weird, I guess. Rick, I just wonder what kind of an audience they're going to have. This is typically not the most watched debate. We're coming off of a 67 million viewership rating on that presidential debate with Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. How many Americans are actually going to stop down on a Tuesday night to watch the running mates?
Yeah, I think it's a tricky formulation because you think about it, too. We just got introduced to both of these candidates, Vance and Walz. They really have no national name ID, which is where the big audience will come from. And they haven't really garnered a lot of attention that's positive. So it's not like everybody's just dying to see their favorite, Walz or Vance. So my guess is you're gonna have a challenge to get an audience. But again, this thing is going to play out online. This is going to play out in tweets and I think both campaigns are well prepared to push out their candidates. So regardless of the TV audience, I think that it'll be a worthwhile exercise. But I wouldn't hold my breath to get this thing to 20 million people.
All right, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano are sticking with us. As coming up, the House moves to Plan B, set to vote on a 3-month continuing resolution to keep the government funded ahead of next week's deadline. We'll have more on that with the panel next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
It's going to be House Democrats who are putting people over politics and putting this issue over the top. Republicans continue to be at war with each other. The chaos and confusion I see across the aisle continues on. We're on track to be the least productive Congress in our nation's history. But this week we are going to get a vote on a clean CR to keep the lights on. And it's going to be the majority of votes coming from House Democrats.
That was Democratic Congressman Wiley Nickel of North Carolina joining us on the earlier edition of Balance of Power today after House Speaker Mike Johnson rolled out Plan B to avert a government shutdown, a 3-month continuing resolution that will keep the government funded until December 20th. So we've got a Christmas showdown now we're set for. Back with us now, our political panel, the signature one at that, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano. So, Jeannie, as the congressman points out, this is very likely to require Democrats to get over the finish line. Is there a net benefit for Democrats in having that vote tally to show, or does the government continuing to be funded essentially render everything neutral for all parties ahead of the election?
Yeah, isn't this a fitting end for this Congress that started out the way it did to end this way? Sort of a blanc. We have a CR for 3 months, just what we all said would happen. I'll give Mike Johnson this. It would have been insanity, political suicide to try to go any other way. We all knew this was going to happen. It was the only way to go. They've pushed the can once again. I think the American public deserve a lot more. I'm not sure anybody gets credit from this, but certainly Mike Johnson was pushing for something that was never going to happen, and I'm not sure what his point was, except that he was serving Donald Trump's interests, and that's a problem for him as he goes forward.
Well, I'll tell you what, there's only one Jeannie Shanzano who shows up with her own sound effects. Rick, there's no SAVE Act in this so-called clean CR, but there is something that was not in prior versions, and that's extra funding for the Secret Service. I find this compelling because a lot of Republicans in the House, when this was a part of the debate last week, suggested that it wasn't a money problem, but a management problem at the agency. Does this pass?
Yeah, I think it passes pretty easily. And they're right. I mean, it probably is a combination of lack of resources financially and bad management. But nobody wants to be the Congress that didn't give the money to the Secret Service in order to protect our nation's leaders, and then something bad happened. So this is more out of abundance of caution than anything.
Well, as we consider caution, there is the question around Donald Trump himself, having weighed in previously, saying that Republicans should not accept a continuing resolution of any duration if there is no election protection mechanism in it. We haven't heard from him today on this new proposal from the House Speaker. Rick, should we assume that's because it has his blessing?
Okay, so I called him the Speaker of the House when he was torpedoing all this other legislation. I've got to retract it. He's no longer Speaker. The Speaker has actually shown some backbone and said, Donald Trump, I'm Speaker. I'll decide what kind of continuing resolutions we have. But, I'm only disappointed that we didn't waste another week. It's only the 23rd of September. We could have been right down to the end of next week, breathlessly waiting for this to happen. So kudos to this Congress. They're actually going to glide into the end of this fiscal year with a continuing resolution. I think that.
Wait, Rick.
That's all I have to say.
We can still find a way.
Right.
Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano have seen this movie before. We've got 1 week until the government runs out of money. Many thanks to both of you for a great conversation. Our signature panel on the Monday edition. Check out the Washington edition newsletter if you want to get up to date on this whole funding debate. There's going to be an important vote Wednesday. You can find it on the terminal and online.
And, of course, you can find us back here tomorrow. So we'll see you then on Bloomberg TV and radio.